world needs more people with curious minds. People who aren't afraid to admit when they don't know something. We need to take the time to encourage more lifelong learners. At least that's my goal with this podcast. I think the future is at stake. But at the same time, I do believe that a more informed population can and will move humanity forward. All we have to do is keep learning. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Got a new mic here. I'm pretty pumped about it. I had to go get a new mic. The old one was a little bit rough on the audio quality. I've had it for a while, so had to go out and grab a new one. I'm excited. I can't just be running out buying mics every other day, but we hit a couple milestones on the show that I'm excited about, and so went out, grabbed a new microphone, and you gotta invest in the things that you believe in, right? So, new microphone, I'm excited about that, and I'm really excited because I think this episode is a trippy one. I'm excited about it. You could probably already tell by the title that this one is going to be a little bit wild, but when you're talking about Nazi space planes, I mean, at the end of the day, you kind of know what you're getting into. So it's a really good story here today. Interesting, thought provoking. It's definitely one of these episodes where I felt like I was as I was going through it. It sort of raised a lot of questions, and I kept researching. This one took me a while to research because I just kept kind of looking into other things and different stories and stuff, and anything from history, man. It's just there's so many crazy stories, and I love history. I'd never heard of this before. Had no idea about this, so I'm excited to tell you guys about it. So let's go ahead and get into the story. So the Nazis were developing a space plane. And remember, this is 20 years before space travel even exists. But during World War II, the Nazis were developing the plane with the intention of bombing American targets, including New York City. What's even crazier is that the guys who were in charge of the project ended up in some very unlikely places. And it's really crazy. I kind of laugh a little bit, but not because World War II or the Nazis is like a funny thing, but it's just crazy. It's almost unfathomable how some of this stuff happened, and it's just wild. Like, it's a wild story. So anyway, the Silbervogel, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is German for silver bird, was a design for a liquid propellant rocket-powered suborbital bomber that was to be used by the Germans in their America Bomber project during World War II. And what's fascinating is that project was an initiative by the German Ministry of Aviation to obtain a long-range strategic bomber that would be capable of striking the United States from Germany in either or a round trip scenario, and that was kind of what they had first thought, or a situation where they would fly across the entire United States, and then, as I think the plan ended up going, and I'll get into that more later, the other option would be to just fly it over the entirety of the United States and then land somewhere in the Pacific, where the Japanese had maybe like a base or an airport. And so the round trip distance from Germany to the United States and back was it sits at approximately 7,200 miles. And so that's why they needed the new type of bomber, because at this point in time, the planes that they already had weren't capable of going and coming back without refueling. And for this type of mission, you basically need to be able to fly over here, drop the bomb, and then head right back. And so it was going to take a new design, and that's where the Silverbird comes in. So on December 3rd, 1941, two manned and one unmanned version of the aircraft were proposed. The manned version of the aircraft, in particular, was to be launched at a very steep angle, and after dropping its bomb load on New York City, was going to continue across the United States and then go land in a base in the Pacific that the Japanese controlled. Now, other aspects of the project that were later discovered were really wild. And one of them was the fact that they found a list of 19 other military targets in the United States that the Germans were thinking about bombing. And they, once again, would need this new type of bomber to reach all of them. But some of these targets included Alcoa, Pratt & Whitney, General Motors, and Chrysler. And basically, the reason they would target these types of companies is because those are the type of companies America was using to build a lot of our war effort, and so they're targets of military importance. But essentially, what would the plan would be there would basically be that this bomber would fly up to suborbital space. So it's so high up that we can't shoot it out of the sky, and then it was going to fly, and also it would be hard to detect on radar, is my understanding. And then it would fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And then as it went over New York City, it would drop bombs on New York City. And then it would continue on a flight path that would take it over some of these parts of the country. Think about it. You could fly theoretically from New York and then start making your way through into the Midwest, where you have some of these companies like a Chrysler or General Motors, right? There were a lot of targets in like Pennsylvania and Indiana, a lot of these manufacturing hubs for the American war machine. And so as it would just travel across America from fucking space, they were just going to drop bombs the whole way through and then go land in the Pacific Ocean. And this was a serious plot that they had. This was at the point where they were actually building components of it. And ultimately, what ended up happening was that all of the aircraft designs that were under consideration for the entire project, and the Silver Bird was just one of them. So there were a couple other designs that they were considering, but they were deemed either too expensive or too ambitious, and they ended up abandoning those projects for more practical weapons research. Hitler was a little bit more concerned with things that they could use right away. And this project was also taking place as obviously America is involved in the war already. And so once we kind of got involved, things started to take a turn. I'm not saying that's just necessarily because of us. My personal opinion is that has everything to do with the Russian front in World War II, to be honest. I don't know how much of a huge difference that we made. And I know people might get upset about that, but the history kind of points to that. But anyway, regardless, the point being, at this point in the war, Hitler kind of, I think, saw that he was starting to run into some serious issues, and so he wanted to focus on more practical technologies, things that they could use right away. So what's interesting is that after World War II, the desire for the Nazis and Nazi collaborators to make a spacecraft didn't go away. And it's at this point in the story where I want to introduce you to a man named Eugen Sanger. And he becomes very important here because Sanger was the aerospace engineer that was responsible for the Silbervogel's design. He was also an alleged member of the SS. And in case you're wondering how much of an actual Nazi this guy was, let's talk about his career path after 1941. So I've got here in my notes that when the project was ultimately scrapped, he was sent to work at the German Institute for Glider Research, which produced gliders for the Hitler Youth and Luftwaffe, which is their like Air Force. He also, after the war, refused to work for the Americans and the British, and we'll get into that a little bit. But he refused to work for the Americans and the British and was ultimately accused of secretly developing the Al-Zafir missile for Egypt. And the reason that they developed that missile was so they could penetrate Israeli airspace after their defeat in the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. So this guy went from working with the Nazis to working with Egypt to help them attack Israel. So I think if you had any questions as to whether or not this guy was a legitimate Nazi, because I'll be honest, when you look into him, it's not the easiest thing to find, and you often find that with a lot of these guys in and around Germany back then. But he is one where it just doesn't get mentioned all that often, but I think we have the context clues here to determine that this dude is a real, actual, serious Nazi. And so anyway, in the early 1960s, he worked for a spaceship design company named Junkers. And Junkers, interestingly enough, had been controlled by the Nazis during World War II and had utilized slave labor from a concentration camp that, quote, had the highest death rate in the entire concentration camp system at the end of 1943. Now, I know you're thinking, well, Nick, that guy's terrible. He's a fucking Nazi. He's the worst. Obviously, yes, he's the worst. The problem, though, is despite all of that information, including the fact that he worked on the Silver Bird, Sanger is still an honorary member of numerous societies for space research in Germany, Great Britain, Austria, the United States, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Argentina, and Italy. And what's interesting is I actually found that I believe it's the New Mexico Space Museum or New Mexico Museum of Aerospace, something along those lines. They have a whole profile on the guy, and they failed to mention him being a part of the SS. They failed to really point out the obvious signs of how much a Nazi this guy was. Instead, they just pick a picture of what seems like an old man who, just a happy older guy who just likes building rockets. And at the end of the day, there's a reason he likes building rockets, and apparently it's so he can kill a bunch of Jewish people pretty much his whole career. So I don't know necessarily if the New Mexico Museum of Space, whatever it's called, is aware of that, but I imagine they are, and for some reason not interested in recognizing that. So anyway, when Sanger died of a heart attack in 1964, the New York Times quoted his Nazi former boss, whose name was Walter Dornberger, multiple times. And Dornberger obviously had nothing but great things to say about Sanger, because of course he did, because they're both Nazis. Anyway, so it is remarkable to me, I guess, is why I get so frustrated, because I'm reading about this and it's fucking crazy. It's a Nazi space plane. I mean, this is insane. And we'll kind of get to why I think that's insane here at the end of the episode. But regardless, the point being, I mean, it's crazy that some of this stuff is just like not really covered. It's like we just want to kind of sweep it under the rug, like, oh yeah, he might have been a Nazi. Like, these guys are definitely Nazis. And I don't know. The fact that he's got all those scientific awards and stuff just kind of pisses me off. So anyway, now it's not shocking that Walter Dornberger said all those nice things about his good friend Eugen Sanger, because Walter Dornberger's history is probably not going to be shocking to you. But you see, he was the Nazi, Dornberger, who was described by Hitler as one of only two men to whom Hitler had ever apologized. And at one point, Dornberger was placed in charge of the V2 rocket program for the Germans that used slave labor from some of the worst concentration camps imaginable. Their rocket program directly used a massive amount of slave labor, a massive amount of labor from the concentration camps. Just horrible. We're not going to get into all the stories right now. I don't want to ruin your day, but just imagine the fact that the V2 rocket program in Nazi Germany was certainly helped perpetrate the entirety of the Holocaust. So just understand what we're talking about there. And this guy, Dornberger, was placed in charge of it. However, after World War II, the United States government apparently didn't mind his previous political affiliation, because he was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip and worked for the United States Air Force, Bell Aircraft Corporation, and was a consultant for Boeing. Dornberger ultimately retired and moved back to Germany. And I mean, that does make sense, because, I mean, after all, actual Nazis really do love the homeland, don't they? And of course he did. Of course he got to come here and work as a consultant and made a bunch of money, and then ultimately went back to Germany and retired. And he died in 1980 at the old age of 84 years old. And that right there is fucking ridiculous in my mind for a host of reasons. But that is the thing about the Silver Bird and the America Bomber Project. The perpetrators of those projects managed to persist, and some of them actually found safety and admiration on the very soil, United States soil, that they planned to bomb during the war. And I'm not saying from the people of the country at the time. That's not what I'm saying, but certainly from our government at the time. I mean, this one Nazi is winning awards. He's getting talked about in a museum here in the United States. The other guy got to consult for large companies. It's not like Boeing went anywhere. They're still around. And they, at one point in their history, paid actual Nazis to help consult with them. So, anyway, the point being is that I think the story of the Nazi space plan is a story of military strategy, and it's also a story of science and The rocket technology that they invented was groundbreaking. That is a fact. I mean, that's why they won these awards. They didn't win these awards because they were Nazis. They won these awards because you couldn't do some of this shit before these guys figured out how to do it. That's obviously why we brought them over here. Um, you have stories from Operation Paperclip, right? You have, for example, a high-ranking member of the SS is Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun is essentially considered the father of NASA. He has won presidential medals and things like that. He was an actual Nazi in World War II, a high-ranking member of the SS. He was part of Operation Paperclip. And so the reality is these aren't the only two Nazis that we left alone, so to speak, after the war. And while it's true that some Nazis were executed by the United States after the war, the problem that I have is the literal Nazis that were architecting a plot to bomb the United States were awarded with awards and consulting jobs. And I think it reminds me of this quote that I heard from Plato, actually, if we go way back in time. But he said, the worst form of injustice is pretend justice. And I think it is pretend justice when, I mean, sure, you executed some of them, but you also brought some of them over here to work for us. And I think it is a bit of pretend justice to portray the United States as coming in and cleaning out the Nazis and sticking up for the Jewish people, when, to be quite honest, some of the worst Nazis ended up coming over here and getting paid by American corporations to do consulting and work for the United States government. To me, that feels a lot like pretend justice. So, at the end of the day, or at the end of this episode, rather, I did want to kind of talk about why I find this so fascinating to begin with. And part of the reason that I found this Nazi space plane so interesting, I wanted to research it, and it took me a while. Like I said, this is one of these episodes I researched for a while, is because it made me rethink a little bit of my thoughts on UFOs. And I want to be clear. I am 100% a believer in aliens, both interdimensional and interplanetary. I believe in both of those forms of aliens 100%. I believe UFOs, very possibly alien craft, at least some of the UFOs that we see. However, I want to take you back and think about a brief history of flight and aircraft. It's the very early 1900s when the Wright brothers invent the airplane, right? It's like 1900. I wish I had wrote it down. I made a note to write it down. Hold on. Let's look it up real quick. I got my laptop right here. Let's go ahead and look it up. I want to say 1903. At Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, the Wright Flyer became the first powered heavier-than-air machine to achieve controlled, sustained flight with a pilot aboard. So, 1903, we have a plane, right? Now, what's fascinating about that is we had no planes before 1903. Then, we use aircraft in war for the first time in, I believe it's 1911. Yep, 1911. We used aircraft for the first time in war in 1911. I believe that what happened was they used that for like reconnaissance, and then I think shortly thereafter that they would fly over enemy targets and just throw grenades out of the planes. So within 8 years of inventing planes, we were already using them for war. But what's fascinating to me is now, if you fast forward like 25 years, Eugen Sanger is already starting to consider the space plane idea and bombing the Americans. 25 years after we started using them in war, and like 35 years after planes were invented. So planes didn't exist, and less than 40 years later, we were already thinking about I'm sure we were too, but the Nazis were already thinking about using a space plane. And so what fascinates me is the fact that they were close. They weren't incredibly close, but they were close before those projects got scrapped. I was looking into it. I mean, if you had given them a little bit more resources and another like 5 years, it's before 1950, and they would have had the space bomber for sure. And so what makes me rethink some of these current UFO sightings is simply the fact that you then have to think about how exponentially quickly technology advanced. After World War II, just in general, just across the board, think about how much more technology we have got over the last 80 years. And keep in mind, next year will be, let's see, 80 years since 1942. So think about that. World War II wasn't that long ago. But anyway, we have had 80 years since World War II. And look how quickly they moved to start militarizing these things. Look how quickly they were thinking about space from the point that we just got flight. So now, if we invented planes and less than 40 years later, they were thinking about, hey, we can make a space plane that can bomb things. What do you think happened for the next 80 years after that? I cannot imagine what they kept working on and what the military already has, especially in this country, because as we covered, a lot of the people that were able to make that shit when no one thought it was possible or started working on it came to work for us. So the United States military could very well have technology that we are completely unaware of. And I do think it's an interesting flex, considering that we seem to be in a Cold War with China right now. There seem to be a lot of tensions with a country like Iran. And I find it interesting that a lot of our UFO sightings do happen right above our own military. Because if we did have a secret military technology, the argument would be we fly it above our own shit, which is the best shit that anyone has. We block their radar, we zoom off, no one can explain it from that ship. They've seen it all. Worse, that's supposed to be the cutting edge technology. And the people that are behind that are terrified of whatever these UFOs are because they're like, we couldn't stop this if we had to. I think that's a bit of a flex if that's actually us. And we're trying to kind of let everybody else know, like, hey, we didn't stop working on this stuff. And I think the fact that you see that exponential growth in technology since World War II, and then when you consider how much we seemed to be focused on air superiority from the moment planes were invented, I do think it's an interesting argument. I don't think it's all of those UFOs, but I do think you have to consider that we are talking about a fucking space plane in 1940. They were trying to build a space plane. They had had planes for like 40 years, and they were trying to build one that could go in space and bomb stuff. So I think that when you look at some of these UFOs as potentially some sort of military technology, and this is some sort of flex that we're doing right now, I think that's very alarming, but it could explain some of it. I'm not fully convinced. I'm just saying the show is called Nick Learns Everything. I learned about this. It's pretty fucking crazy. I mean, this is really kind of wild to consider that they were going this route in the 1940s. And so I don't know. I think that's okay. At the end of the day, that's a little bit what this show is about, right? You got to learn about stuff. I don't know what's going on. I have no idea what those UFOs are. That's okay. Doesn't have to be one thing or the other. It can be both. I always say this. It can be both. Some of them can be us with some secret military stuff. Some of them are interplanetary aliens. Some of them might be interdimensional aliens. I believe in all that shit. So at the end of the day, that's what it is. I think it's just fun to learn about this stuff. I don't know. It's weird. It's one of those things. I think the more that you learn, the more that you can reform your thinking in certain areas. I think the more you get closer to the truth. And this is not something that's going to relate to my daily life at all, but it is fun. I do enjoy it. And, at the end of the day, you learn stuff. You learn things. I learned a lot of stuff here that I didn't even cover. And so, I don't know. I really enjoyed researching this episode, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. So, anyway, it's Friday right now. Go grab yourself a margarita. If you're hearing this right now, have a good weekend. Spend some time with your friends and family. That's all I got for you guys. Enjoy it. Have a good weekend. Hope you like this episode. And anyway, just keep trying to learn new stuff, and I'll see you guys next time.